reaching over like this. If you had a steady rest, it would help, right? Okay, use your vise as a steady rest. It's solid, it's firm, and it's holding the fly. So it works great. Now, one way you can do it is just to reach up a finger and touch the vise. You'd be surprised how much that helps. The other thing you can do is take your other hand and use it as a steady rest by steadying it against your vise. And you can use a finger, thumb, part of the hand, whatever it takes to steady your other hand. And you'd be surprised how much this helps when you're doing operations like this that have to be precise. Work the epoxy around the thread head, be thorough, get underneath. And then set this fly aside for the epoxy to cure. If it's a fast curing epoxy, then even in an hour or so you can take the fly fishing. If it's a slow curing epoxy, it could take several hours, but you have the advantage of that much time in which to work with the epoxy and put epoxy on other thread heads. Now, the best way to do this, if you're trying to do a bunch of flies, is to tie a bunch of flies and then put the head cement on all the flies at once. It's just a lot more efficient and a lot faster. Take this out of your vise, set it somewhere, or better yet, get a block of wood or a block of styrofoam, stick it into the block of wood or styrofoam, and set that aside. Then you know that that head is up and it's not touching anything, it's not going to get glued to anything. Check on your fly before you put it in the block, and even a little later is not a bad idea, and make sure that the epoxy or whatever head cement you used didn't go in and fill the eye of the hook. Now, if you're using a conventional head cement and it fills the eye, it's not that big a deal. Later with another hook point or a needle, you can clear it out. But if you're using the epoxy, this stuff, again, is really tough, and you would have a difficult time getting it out of the eye. So remove it from the eye now. Be extra careful if it's epoxy. You know, it's a good idea to check your fly a little while later, 10 or 15 minutes later, and make sure that that epoxy or even the head cement has not filled the eye. Now, if it does fill the eye at any time when the cement is still not fully cured, here's a great way to clear that eye. This is just a feather. This happens to be what's called a hackle, but it doesn't matter. Any feather with a stem and some fibers is fine. And I just stripped a little bit of the stem clear, and I'm going to put that through the eye and then pull it through. And as I pull it through, it cleans out all that cement in the eye. That's a good way to go. This is the Rix Caddis. This is going to be the toughest fly that you will tie out of this book. The reason it's the toughest fly is because it's the first fly. We've had to cover a lot of ground with this fly, a lot of basics. From now on, we're going to move a little more slowly, and we'll just keep referring back to the things that you've learned at this point. And a couple of new techniques per fly. We're going to keep rolling. It's going to get easier, if anything. So just stick with it. When you feel comfortable tying this fly, or even if you don't, go on to the next fly. The next fly we're going to tie is called the White and Grizzly Woolly Bugger. The woolly bugger is a close cousin of the old standby, the woolly worm, which was terribly popular for a lot of years, and now it seems the woolly bugger is as popular as the woolly worm was. You're going to learn here how to perform the pinch and a little bit about hackle. The woolly bugger is tied in all sizes and different color combinations. It's weighted or unweighted. It's fished deep or shallow in streams and lakes, usually with a twitching or pulsing action, and it can be used for a great variety of fish, most commonly trout, but sometimes char, Atlantic salmon, steelhead, bass, and even saltwater species. The woolly worm was created by Russell Blessing. The first thing you need to do in tying the woolly bugger is to select a hackle. Now, you can use a standard dry fly hackle and find one of the webbier, larger hackles, but better yet, I think, is to use a large saddle hackle. Now, to select the proper hackle, you can either do it by using the hook or you can do it by using a hackle gauge. If you use a hackle gauge, as you can see that I have two types here. One sits on the stem of the vise, and one goes into the vice's jaws. I'll use the one that goes into the vice's jaws this time. When you use a hackle gauge, notice that it's the longest fibers which indicate on the gauge what size hackle you have. Get one that matches the size of your hook. In this case, it's a size 6 hook. Prepare that hackle by stripping the fuzz from the stem. And you'll notice that the hackle has plenty of good hard fibers, about the same length down here, and then the fibers tend to be quite a bit longer down here at the base. Strip the ones off the base off of both sides until you have bare stem. Now, set that prepared hackle aside. Put the hook in your vise. Now, as I was saying about hooks, there is quite a bit of variation from manufacturer to manufacturer. This hook is supposed to be 4x long. It looks to me like it's longer than that. But regardless, it still makes a very good woolly bugger. So, as I say, it's not all that important. Start the thread as before, just behind the eye, maybe an 1/8 inch or so. Spiral it quickly back to the bend. Now we're going to take a marabou plume, a white marabou plume, and to control that plume, we're going to use this cup of water. Just dip my fingers in there, and then stroke some of the water into the plume. Marabou is kind of fluffy, soft stuff, and it moves around and tends to be hard to control unless you wet it down. Now measure that plume against the hook. Hold it down so the tip of the plume comes to where the bend begins, and then note the point where the eye is. That's 1 shank length. Grasp the marabou plume at that point. Move it back to the bend, and now we're going to use a technique that I call the pinch. This is a great way to tie in soft materials. Bring your thread up on the near side. Now tuck it back between your thumb and the material, and now it's held there. Bring it down the far side and tuck it back. You can even roll your finger back a little between your finger and the material. Now you've got a loop of thread enclosing the material. Open the joints, your second joint on your first finger and your first joint on your thumb, spread them apart a bit, and that will roll your thumb tip and fingertip forward over the loop of thread. Now you've got the loop and the material enclosed in the center of your finger and thumb. You've got control of that material, and as you pull down on the loop, the material will stay right atop the hook. Now as soon as you've got that on there, add a few tight turns of thread right in the same place, and you've got the tail of the woolly bugger tied in. Lift that marabou out of the way and spiral the thread quickly to just up behind the eye, maybe 1/8 of an inch or 3/16, something like that. Now you can do another pinch if you want, or you can do what I just did, which is to drape the bobbin over the other side. Again, you could just use the pinch again. Back between the thumb and the material, down the far side between the finger and the material, open the joints, roll them forward, pull it tight. Either way is fine. You can snip this off now or later, but I'll do it now so it's a little clearer so you can see what's going on. And spiral the thread again down to the bend. A word of caution. Remember that when you're working with materials at the bend, you don't want to go any further back towards the bend than the first wraps. In other words, these thread wraps at the bend, the furthest ones back, I don't want to wrap any further than that again. If I do, I'll start knocking the tail out of position and causing all kinds of problems. So just go back to the same spot, or maybe slightly ahead of it. Now, take your stripped hackle and use the pinch to tie it in right at the bend. Lift it, spiral the thread forward again. Use the pinch if you like, tie in the front of the hackle stem. And now cut that. Now we're going to take this large chenille. We're not going to take that piece. We're going to take this large chenille, cut off a few inches, And then use the pinch to tie that in. We're about 1/8 to 3/16 behind the eye. Hold the chenille up slightly above the shank under light tension and spiral the thread down it to the bend. Now, if your chenille slipped out when you were holding it just now, the way to avoid that is either to get that turn that it's tied in with quite tight, or to add several tight turns before you take your next step. Spiral it right back to the bend, but no further than the previous wraps, no further back, and then spiral your thread forward again to just a little bit behind the eye, maybe 1/8 of an inch. Now, take the chenille, pass it from hand to hand as you wind it in consecutive turns up the shank. Just keep wrapping that chenille. Oops. Until you get right up to the eye. Now hold the chenille slightly tipped off the eye. Bring your bobbin over, this is for right-handers, with your left hand, and drape it over the other side. This way you kept your chenille tight and you got your first turn of thread. Pull out a little bit tight. Now you can let go. Add a few more turns and snip that chenille closely. With the body completed, it's time to wrap the hackle. Now you can do this by handing the hackle from hand to hand if it's a long enough hackle, and not even bothering with hackle pliers. However, especially since it's a little early in the game, why don't you use your hackle pliers and get used to them. Attach the hackle pliers to the tip of the hackle. Use plenty of the hackle. This tip section has got short fibers anyway, and if you get too close to the tip, you'll find you're always breaking your hackle pliers out. Put the hackle pliers in line with the stem of the hackle, and as you wrap, keep the hackle pliers in line. Now you can hold them like this, as I am, between your first finger and your thumb, or you can put your finger through the loop, like this. Make at least 4 turns of hackle, and up to 7 or 8. There's no hard rule on this fly at all. It's kind of one of those flies that everybody ties his or her own way. And remember that with hackles, this is not as tough as thread or some of the materials. Don't wrap it too tightly, just snug. That's something you need to adjust to. You'll break a few hackles in finding out, but just make sure that it's snug. And if you keep pretty much the same angle as you wrap, you will find that the hackle, turns of hackle, the palmered hackle, that these turns are pretty evenly spaced. Just keep that same angle. Now when you get to the eye, you have a choice. You can just stop here and tie off the hackle, or some people like to take a couple of extra turns right in front of the eye, right behind the eye. Tip your hackle pliers off the eye a little bit with your right hand. This is for right-handers. And with your left hand, bring the bobbin up and drape it over the far side. When you've got a couple of turns on there, you can open your hackle pliers, release the tip, and then make another turn or two, and then reach in closely and snip off the tip. If there are any problems here, any materials, hackle fibers, for example, that are sticking forward that you don't want, just snip them out. Snip them right at their base. And now we're going to use a technique called the triangle to pull these fibers back out of the way to create a thread head. Put your first finger to your thumb and your second finger against the tips of your thumb and your first finger. Now you'll see that in the center of all that, there's a little space. The space is sort of triangular shaped. That's why I call this the triangle. Draw the triangle over the eye of the hook. As you do, lighten the tension between your thumb and your second finger just enough to let the thread slip through, but not enough to allow anything else to slip through. Now the further you go back with the triangle, the clearer your access is to create the thread head. However, if you go back too far, you find that things start popping loose. So you just have to adjust. You want to be back more or less as far as you can be, but This isn't a big deal. You just need to be far enough back to get good access. Now we're going to build a thread head. This is created simply by adding turns of thread, more turns at the rear of the head than the front, so that it has a tapered shape, going from small at the front to large at the rear, sort of a cone shape. And that's a thread head. All that remains now is to add some half hitches to secure that head. This is the gold-ribbed hare's ear. It's most likely the most popular nymph in America right now. And the reasons for that are that it's easy to tie and that it catches a lot of fish. It can be tied weighted or unweighted, and it's generally fished in streams dead drift, that is, without any artificial motion, either up near the surface or right down along the bottom. And when it's fished in lakes, it's usually made to swim along, again, either deep or shallow. I began by smashing the barb, as we did before, and then I added a layer of thread from just behind the eye, maybe 1/8 of an inch, to just past the center of the shank. Now on top of that layer of thread, I'm going to spin on some lead. Sometimes lead is crumbly. If you run into that, then keep sliding your grip down the lead as you wrap it. Then you won't fatigue it at one particular point. The lead on this fly, if you're going to use lead, should run from somewhere around the center of the shank to about 1/8 of an inch behind the eye. Just remember that you need plenty of room behind the eye. You don't want to crowd it. Now we'll tie it in the usual manner. Thread dam, spiral the thread quickly forward. Thread dam, spiral it back. Now spiral it all the way to the bend. And at the bend, we're going to tie in the tails. You can use almost anything for the tails of a hare's ear. I'm going to use hare's mask. This is the most common tailing material and the one usually called for. Snip out just a little bit of it right off the mask. And then pull some of the fuzz out of the base of these fibers so that you leave the long hairs called guard hairs. A little batch of these, not too many. Measure them against the hook so they're about half the length of the hook or so. A little longer or shorter is fine. And use the pinch to tie these in at the bend. Now, you have two choices. You can either sort of follow the butts of the fibers up and keep them in place as you add turns of thread over them, kind of light turn of thread and then pull it tight. Or you can just snip them off back there after you add a few tight securing thread turns. Right behind the lead, we're going to tie in the gold tinsel. Now, this is oval gold tinsel. You can use flat if you choose. This is just stiff enough material to use a technique that I call the light turn. With materials that are stiff, or at least somewhat stiff, you simply hold the material there, use just enough thread tension to control the thread, no more, no less, and take a light tension turn over the material. When the turn is taken, pull the thread tight. That's all you do. Just remember, not too much tension or the material will slide around in front of the thread, and not too little or you don't have any control over the thread. Lift this up, spiral the thread down it to the bend. You can keep that out of your way in the material holder if you like. Now, you have some choices. You need hare's mask material for this next step. You can buy the mask like this and then trim some of it away. And if you trim some of it away, trim it from between the eyes and then from the ears. Don't get these bushy cheek areas or up here on top of the head. Grotesque, isn't it? Take some of this And you can hand blend it like this, just pulling it apart, sticking it back together, and pretty soon it will be blended fairly well. Or you can use the blender. Or you can buy bags of this material pre-blended. The only thing is, if you buy the pre-blended material, you'll have to use something else. For example, pheasant tail fibers or some other kind of feather fibers that are soft to create the tails, because you won't have the mask to draw the fibers off of. So if you want to buy it pre-blended, do it. But just remember that we'll have to use something as an alternate for the tails, which is no big deal. Now we're going to dub, as usual, and we're going to try to create a tapered abdomen that runs from the tail, that's right at the bend, of course, of the hook, up to just past halfway up the shank. And we just keep dubbing that material on. Now you have a couple choices here. You can dub the material on a little bit at the beginning and more heavily as you get up. That will create the tapered abdomen. Or you can dub it on equally and then just build it more as you go up. Take more turns each time so that you have that taper. Either way is fine. Now start wrapping that. Again, right back to those furthest to the rear thread turns, but no further, or you'll knock your tail out around. Build up that tapered abdomen so it starts at small and then builds up as it reaches just past the center of the shank. If you have extra dubbing, draw it off of the thread now. Now, let your bobbin hang. With the abdomen dubbed, take up the oval gold tinsel and wrap it in spaced ribs up the tapered abdomen. Now you can increase the space between the ribs as you go, or you can keep it the same. I don't care. And I know the fish don't care. Anywhere from 4 to 6 ribs is about right. And go right up to the front of the abdomen, which is again a little past halfway up the shank. Now hold the material off the eye, and with your left hand, this is for right-handers, work that bobbin over in a few turns to secure the material, and then trim it off with the insides of your scissor blades, well down in there, so that you don't damage the points. The next thing we need to do is to create the wing case for this nymph. Normally this is done with mottled turkey quill, but as a substitute you could use duck quills or even pheasant tail fibers. When you're tying flies, you have to be flexible. This is called substitution when you use other materials. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's standard procedure. Cut a section from the turkey quill about like this and measure it against the hook. This part of the hook between the point and the shank is called the gape. We want this section to be a little bit smaller than the gape. This is a matter of personal preference, but a little bit smaller than the gape, so you can always strip some off the side and peel it off the section if you have too much. Now we're going to roll the cut base of this around the top of the lead. Of course, if you didn't weight this hook, you won't have lead there, but that's all right. You can add a little extra dubbing or just put it around the shank. Now take a light turn over that. Roll your thumb and finger forward to support it, sort of a variation of the pinch, and then pull tight. And now you've preserved the flatness of that material. You don't have it bunched together, you actually have it rolled flatly around the top half of the lead and the shank of the hook. Secure that with plenty of tight thread turns. If you need to, go in and trim the end of the section, which you may not have to do, depending on how you tied it in. And now we're going to take some more of the hare's mask. This time we want to dub more heavily. If you recall, this is similar to what we did on the Rix caddis. What we're trying to do here is to create the effect of legs by this roughness. Remember that there are guard hairs in here, the same kind of hairs we used for the tail of this fly, and we're going to use those to create the effect of legs. So our next step is going to be to dub the thread heavily and build up a nice thick thorax. Make sure you cover all the lead whenever you have a weighted fly. The lead should not be showing. In fact, it's not a bad idea to go to go back and take a look at both sides of the fly before you decide you're done dubbing, so you can be sure that there isn't any lead showing, because actually it's pretty common knowledge that real mayfly nymphs do not have any visible lead. Take this fiber, this section, pull it flatly over the eye of the hook, hold it there under modest tension. You don't have to pull it real tight or it may pull back out later. And with your left hand, for right-handers, drape the bobbin over the hook again. Okay, now you can add a few tight turns. Make sure you've got that well secured before you cut this, because you'll have to go backwards through a few steps and untie the fly before you can fix it if this slips loose. Now use a little moisture. That will help you control those fibers. And draw all this stuff, the fibers and everything, back away from the eye to create a thread head. Now if you pull down on your bobbin a little bit, that will also help you secure those wing case fibers as you do this. Build up your thread head. Give it three half hitches as before. Add head cement. The final thing you'll do is to reach in with your scissor tips or something sharp, a bodkin, a needle, whatever, and tease some of these fibers out to the sides of the thorax region so that you get the effect of legs. And that is how you tie a very popular and killing fly, the gold-ribbed hare's ear. The components of a dry fly do not differ all that much from those of a nymph, but let's take a look at them because there are some differences. These are the tails, no surprises there. This is the body, which is sometimes called the abdomen. Depends on whether there's a thorax or not. This is the hackle collar. This is the traditional hackle collar, which is often found on catskill dry flies, other traditional dry flies. And these are the wings. In this case, these are hackle tip wings. Notice that they are upright, as they often are on dry flies, although sometimes they are down wings, which come back over the body. We'll see more about that a little later. And of course, the thread head is right there. The Adams is the first dry fly that we will tie. Dry fly, of course, means that it's supposed to float, not sink. And the Adams was created by a fellow named Len Halliday. It's been very popular for a lot of years, and I think part of the reason it's so popular is because it's sort of nondescript. It looks a little bit like just about everything. And so it's a very versatile fly. If you have a question about what fly to tie on, a lot of guys will say, make it the Adams. So it's a good place to start. It's a traditional dry fly in its makeup. It has a tail, a body, a hackle collar, and upright wings. We start our thread just back from the eye of the hook, a 1/16 of an inch or a little more. Wrap back to just short of mid-shank. Cut the thread, and now wrap forward over that first layer of thread to just short of the center of that first layer of thread. Now the wings are the first thing that we will tie in. Hen saddle is my favorite. This is great stuff for wings on hackle tip winged dry flies. And there are other things you can use.